So after listening to the lawyers and the technologists, we'll give the floor to the social scientists. We have a few minutes for discussion, so if anyone wants to raise any questions or anything, just raise your hand. And there's a microphone, I think. Oh, great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everybody for coming out. It was really informative. I guess this is a question for Ben, first of all. You had talked about the legal regime that had confronted Snowden after his leaks, and I'm gonna go straight to hell for this question. But I'm thinking about him in conversation with somebody like Daniel Ellsberg, who, after submitting the Pentagon Papers, came back and submitted himself to the courts for review and ended up going to prison. It seems like Snowden's move to leave the country kind of creates an opportunity for the administration to continue to harp on him as only a criminal, whereas if he was to come back to the United States, it would force a more comprehensive discussion about the role of the surveillance state, the power of whistleblowers, even the formation of the news media within the complex of the state. And I'm curious what your thought on that is. That being said, I'm not really interested in seeing the man go to prison for the rest of his life. So.
Right. Well, look, I think that this is a reasonable question to raise. If someone could fix the echo.
Oh, what's happening?
No, I'm just hearing myself.
Oh.
It's Skype.
In a distracting way.
Can you take your headphones off, maybe?
Okay. Well, that's better. So I think first a few comparisons to Ellsberg that are important. At the time that Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, the Espionage Act had never, in the history of the United States, been used against someone who leaked information to the press in the public interest. So it was not at all that Ellsberg was looking at a certain life, his act of conscience. And in fact, it was very likely that the court in his case have dismissed the charges against him under our First Amendment. We've since learned this. As you know, the case against Ellsberg fell apart because of political corruption and misconduct, that the Nixon administration offered the judge a position as head of the FBI during the course of those proceedings, and the judge threw that out. But again, this was a very, very different legal regime that Daniel Ellsberg was facing in the early 1970s, where the constitutionality of the Espionage Act as applied to whistleblowers was a very open question. And in 2013, when it was beyond doubt that Snowden would have faced life in prison for what he did without any opportunity to defend himself on public interest grounds. So, a second point about this is that think about how the last year would have proceeded if, after the first publication of the first Guardian story, Edward Snowden was disappeared into solitary confinement in the United States. Not only would we have been deprived of his voice over the last year, as someone who has been one of the most knowledgeable and articulate advocates of reform, but the reporters who have been reporting on these stories would have had a very, very hard time doing so without his assistance. There aren't a lot of people within the intelligence community who are stepping forward to help the reporters who have these documents understand what they mean, because they're terrified of being prosecuted or worse for doing so. And so he has really been integral to the journalism that has come out over the last year as well. Again, finally, I think that as Snowden himself has said, there's an independent value to his demonstration that it's possible to take on the world's most powerful surveillance regime and not be crushed by it. And to him, it was very important to show that you could do what he did and not end up in prison forever. He wanted to show what happens when you create the kind of perverse incentive system that treats whistleblowers as spies, that if the U.S. had a legal regime that didn't give 35-year prison sentences to Bradley Manning while no torturers got any prison time at all, then maybe Snowden would have stayed in the U.S. to defend himself instead of going to an airport. But I also think that he was trying to establish this as a model for people, that it was possible to do what he did and not have to sacrifice one's entire life to do that. Look, I think this is a legitimate question and a legitimate debate, but I hope that people who advocate that he return home, and many of them are much more forceful in that advocacy than this question, what they're essentially saying is that the person whose disclosures led to the highest journalism prizes, that led to a historic global debate, new judicial opportunities, new parliamentary opportunities, changes in technology, that this person should submit himself to a regime that will not allow him to defend himself on public interest grounds at all. That there would be no trial where these issues were raised. The only question for a court or a jury in this case would be, did he know that this was national defense information? And did he know that the people he gave it to were not authorized to receive it? I think we all know the answers to those questions. And I believe that he should not be rewarded for his act of conscience with a lifetime behind bars.
Any other questions in the audience? There's one there.
Thanks. Yeah, hi, I have a question to Mr. Bowden on the issue of the balkanization of the internet. If I understood you correctly, you said, well, it's not necessarily a bad thing to prevent data from getting out and being stored on US servers and so on, which makes sense. But wouldn't this step or this move more or less automatically lead to the second step, namely preventing unwanted data or information getting in? Basically, data that our governments don't want to see in the European network. And wouldn't that more or less lead to censorship?
May I ask, do you have a technical background?
Yes.
Okay, so if you want to block data getting into a region, then you basically have to build a great firewall of Europe. So nobody I know has proposed that. I haven't proposed that. Nobody's been proposing that in the past year that I've seen. But it is invoked as a straw man to try and sort of knock down to build up this balkanization bogeyman. I don't understand how these problems relate to each other at all. I mean, I've been studying privacy technologies for 15 years, and yes, there is a deep interconnection between censorship and privacy. But at this level of discussion, you've got to say that this balkanization talk is simply US propaganda to try and knock down the enormous economic force that Snowden revelation is having on US business, and much worse to come, I would say. No one's talking about building a great firewall with all that entails in terms of filtering apparatus, looking at every packet, trying to block mechanisms like Tor, for example, to circumvent censorship. All that is going on here is a failure to separate two kinds of data. There's basically data that you want published and ought to be public, and it doesn't really matter where you put that, and no one's talking about restricting that. But there's data which is supposed to be confidential to somebody for some purpose, and that data is totally vulnerable to NSA mass surveillance as soon as you put that in anything called cloud computing. And it's simply a good idea to not to send that data really to any other computers than you absolutely have to, given what we now know about how sophisticated the methods are for breaking into computers. So I hope that clarifies it.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? There's two more here at the front. Liliana, there's Lion, and behind David Lion.
Hi, I wondered whether, like Snowden has quite some trust in encryption as a basic form of protection. And I wondered if you know of any organizations who are kind of taking up this claim and working towards the idea that encryption should be a basic form of literacy, that should be taught on schools.
So I think that's an excellent point. When I first started learning about all of this a very long time ago in the 90s, I got an unusual job. I'll tell you an anecdote which I haven't told probably an audience this size before. I was nervous about GCHQ not wanting another Labour government after 18 years in power of a Tory government. So through a very unusual chain of circumstances and through nothing official, I got the job of trying to train the shadow cabinet spin doctors in how to use PGP. And this was in 1997. So, of course, they weren't able to generate keys themselves. I had to generate the keys for them. And so I wrote a memo to a senior official saying, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to keep the keys? If anything goes wrong, I can recover the situation, or give everyone their own key, and if something goes wrong on the road for the next 3 weeks of the political campaign, you're on your own. I can't help you. So I kept the keys, which does mean in the literal sense I was Tony Blair's trusted third party. I should say I left any association with the Labour Party behind in the end of 2000. But what I learned from that is there's something about asymmetric encryption, the idea that you need a different key to decrypt than the key you use to encrypt, which is integral to all modern cryptographic systems, including PGP. There's something about that idea which doesn't compute in most people's minds. You have to be a sort of geek. And I think this is actually one of the crucial psychological reasons why there hasn't been more successful deployment of asymmetric encryption, is you have to get over this hurdle of something which is very, very counterintuitive. And you can explain it to people and say, okay, so, which means they don't really understand it. You can explain it to them until they start to get a headache, and then they say, look, I can't really do this anymore, Caspar. Can we take a break for half an hour? And they still don't understand it. Or finally, they might actually understand it with some kind of analogy. But you have to get over that hump. And this is a problem that user interface design and encryption has not even begun to tackle. And I'm sort of slightly surprised that this hasn't been recognized as one of the crucial problems. I don't think it's insoluble. I think that, in fact, in Microsoft in 2003, I actually proposed, why don't we make it really easy to integrate PGP with Outlook? And I basically was sort of laughed out of every building that I proposed that in Microsoft. You know, they said, why do we want to do that? We'd upset the FBI. I mean, really, Caspar, think commercially. So the fact is that none of the sort of great engineering talent in the enormous computer companies dominating the internet has really had to apply their minds to this problem of how to make encryption really easy to use. If you create regulatory incentives, then their hearts and brains will follow. So I don't think it's an impossible job. Just to one further point is your thing about education in schools. I think that is vital. I think that really every child by the age of 12 should understand how to do asymmetric encryption, because the brain can absorb concepts then, which becomes much, much more difficult to inculcate later. So a few central ideas about how security and privacy work on the internet at some level of technical detail, the same as we expect people to do, you know, quadratic equations if you do any kind of secondary school mathematics. It's just something you have to do, and I think it should be part of the curriculum.
If I can add to this and slightly disagree, well, I know one more reason why Microsoft didn't want encryption is mostly for commercial reasons, not just NSA or FBI relationship building, but you know, basically they want to read the data and use data for their own purposes as well. And if we encrypt our
Actually,
emails,
Kasia, in that particular case, it's not true, because in fact, Microsoft, I mean, I'm the last person to defend Microsoft, but at that stage, actually, Microsoft was making a big deal about the fact they didn't scan mail like Gmail.
Yeah, well, then that changed in the meantime, and now Gmail is using it, obviously, for that reason. But back to the core issue, I know many organizations trying to do this job, including my own one. We do education. Apart from legal work, we do quite a lot of education, and our current leaflets advertising our NGO basically has on its backside encryption, you know, major steps you have to take to encrypt your emails, because we do think this is the first thing we have to start thinking about if you want to increase your privacy. And that's also what Snowden said in his recent public lecture, that this is the only thing we have left. Of course, the geeks will tell you that probably there are still holes in it, and even asymmetric encryption is not the perfect tool to safeguard our privacy, but still it's better than doing nothing. And as a non-techie person, I've been using that tool for a while, and I don't really agree that this is that counterintuitive. You just by practicing it, you are quickly adopting this rule. So I would be much more optimistic than Caspar, and I still think that that job should be done by many organizations, and it is being done by many organizations.
Did Ben have a comment on that previous question?
Ben, would you like to comment on that? On the education?
Yeah, I mean, I think very briefly, I think that solutions that require individuals to be better educated are going to be very, very incomplete. That the changes are going to have to take place at a system level. That, you know, companies like Google and Yahoo making the decision to go to SSL by default, you know, affect millions or hundreds of millions of people in 1 second. And expecting people to learn how to use Tails or Tor or PGP is only going to be a marginal solution, at least in the foreseeable future, until or unless education changes dramatically. And one of the things that I hope that we will see coming out of the Snowden revelations is a robust new market for technology products that build in end-to-end decryption, so that we aren't mostly using advertising companies as our main email providers and cloud storage providers. We're not going to get everything we want from a company like Google that is, remember, an advertising company. It will protect us against some kinds of state surveillance, but unless it can read our emails, it doesn't know which of its real customers it should sell us to. So we're going to need to have some much more sort of mainstreamed alternatives to the current offerings that we're all given. But I'm not optimistic that that public education and, you know, convincing more people that they individually should use encryption is going to make much of a difference.
Just come back with one point on that. I mean, I think there is a fallacy around about can't we just have hosted services for email which somehow take care of this security for us? And the point about using SSL to the cloud. SSL, even if it works, and of course the last few weeks we know that it doesn't, then that only provides a tunnel protecting your data between your computer and when it arrives in some dark sort of bunker in Idaho, as Evgeny Morozov said, as a working definition of the cloud. So, in fact, there is no technical architecture. There is no technical architecture which, as it were, can save you from a service provider getting a FISA warrant. And, of course, if you're not a US citizen and you have reason, even if you don't have reason, to think that your activities or your friends' activities may be of interest for the foreign policy of another government or affect their interests in any way, well, you shouldn't trust that remote service. So unfortunately, we do have to force ourselves back to this technical situation of choosing your own laptop or device, figuring out what encryption software to run on it and why you should trust it, and then learning to use it properly. And the trouble is, when you have to do that, it's okay, Kasia, when things are going well. But if something goes wrong with your keys, or there's some complicated situation about who signed my key and can I trust this signature, that's just too complicated for people, for most people, to handle. But I do think that within a generation, within 20 years, we could actually have a new generation of young people who in school had learned how to do this, you know, in a reasonable kind of way.
Thanks. I really like the point you made, Kasia, about the contradictory role in which the corporations find themselves, that on the one hand they are challenging government, but on the other hand they are also collecting far more than they need. And I just wondered if you had some practical suggestions, you or other panel members, about how corporations could themselves be held to account in the way that you seemed to be heading towards in those comments.
Thank you for this question. The answer could be very long, but I understand we have very little time. So to be very brief, the obvious first step for me would be to force foreign companies, meaning not European companies, to observe at least what we have now as European legal standard, which is not perfect, I will never say that, but it's far better, far more privacy protective than US. It's actually, in my understanding, almost the opposite of what we have in the US. So that process has started politically in Europe. I also mentioned briefly in my speech before that we have European data protection reform being out there for last 2 or more years, so being proposed and discussed in the Parliament, and now it got stuck in the European Council because of lack of political consensus on how we want to pressure our American business partners basically to adjust their standards, or at least force their companies to apply European standards. So that's a politically sensitive issue, but it's the first obvious step. The next one might be some form of even self-regulation. Once we have that bottom line for everybody the same, we could start encouraging companies to compete with security as the value that they can offer to customers. I see that happening, and I meet many startups now in Europe who say that, yes, we are ready to compete with this value. So another idea might be a business model to support these new developments where privacy or security become something attractive for customers in the same way as Google was attractive with something else before.
So, David, in answer to your question, in the report I did for the Parliament, I proposed essentially a three-pronged strategy. The first is to provide legal protection and asylum for whistleblowers like Edward Snowden. And I haven't mentioned Snowden so far myself. I'd like to say strongly that I'm a great admirer of his enormous courage and guts to do what he did in a very deliberate fashion, from what we know. The second proposal to the Parliament was that we should encourage a European cloud software industry. I mean, as entrepreneurial, as innovative as Silicon Valley, how to get there is another question. But in some sense, if the cloud is as important as everybody says, this is something Europe should want to do anyway. It's only after 20, 25 years of hiccups that Airbus now has a 50% global market share with Boeing. The cloud industry is going to be bigger than the airline industry. Why isn't this a core part of EU industrial policy now? Well, the answer is interesting. This area of policy falls within DG Connect, as they've now called themselves. It used to be DG Information Society. But, DG Connect and its precursors' policy for the past at least 15 years, probably 20, has been to pretend foreign intelligence agencies doesn't exist. Their mantra is always they must promote trust and confidence. They're not really interested in whether that trust or confidence is well-founded or protecting against realistic threats, whether those are criminal threats or indeed threats from foreign intelligence surveillance. If you look closely at the detail of Neelie Kroes's policy in the last 9 months and DG Connect's cloud policy, it has not changed one iota in substance. Of course, there's been nice speech-making, but the actual policy has remained the same, which is the policy before, which is foreign intelligence agencies don't exist, your data is safe in the cloud, it doesn't matter which cloud you put your data in, jurisdiction is not important, we all can just compute a bit more cheaply as a sort of saving marginal cost to try and cut some costs out of the rest of business. Well, this is nonsense, but it is sort of remarkable and true that European Commission policy completely unchanged because they don't know what to do. The third element of the policy was to impose very heavy fines on US companies which comply, or indeed other foreign companies which comply with their own governments, to, as it were, enforce their local laws to the disadvantage of the human rights of people living here. But in some sense, Marissa Mayer of Yahoo said this at quite an early stage of the Snowden controversy, that if she told what she knew about Pfizer, she could have gone to jail under the same laws that Ben has described for a very long period of time, 10 or possibly 30 years, even under some interpretations of the Espionage Act, a death penalty. I mean, I'm not saying that's likely, but that's in there. So if you have on the one hand this deliberate conflict of law, which I think the EU should set up, so that if a US company complies with US law, they're breaking EU law, they might get a fine if the EU finds out about it, and if they manage to complete a very ponderous and, at this scale of fine, unprecedented prosecution. Or, if they comply with US law and don't tell the US regulators, well, they keep the American courts happy, the EU's probably never going to find out about it, and if they did comply with the EU law, the chances of a long spell in jail. So what's a US company going to do? So in fact, we need to go much further than current EU proposals and actually get to a stage where it is a criminal offence under US domestic law to maltreat, particularly Europeans' data. And this is not something the Commission yet is clearly asking for.
Good too.
Anything you'd like to add, Ben? No. So we have one more person in the audience. We're really running out of time, so I'd rather go for all the remaining questions if there are more than one at the same time. So anyone else would like to say anything? Because if not, I'm just going to close it after this last, yeah, okay.
Yes, good evening. Wondering if there's been very much academician focus or policy focus on the EU side in the period of time that it will take for the EU to legislatively come to solutions. What about corporate governance and requiring, when you contract with American companies, contractually that they comply with the EU or they don't get the contract?
Well, the trouble is, how can a contract actually stop a foreign intelligence agency lawfully acting in its own jurisdiction? This is what I've never, in fact, it's funny you mentioned this, I've just resigned from the European Commission group on trying to draft new contracts for cloud computing. And in fact, 15 years ago, I was in the earliest discussions as civil society on this notion of somehow using contracts to protect international data flows. It's always seemed to me absurd, and I said so back then, and I say so even most strongly now. If company A in Europe does a contract, legally binding contract with company B in the US, there are the so-called approved model clauses to do that. Well, guess what? Even since 2001, those model clauses say if company B in the US receives a legally binding request under the US jurisdiction, then they have to comply. They're allowed to comply under the terms of that contract. But even if that sort of get out of jail clause wasn't there, well, there's no way that a corporation in US jurisdiction is going to be able to say to the NSA, oh, sorry, we can't comply with this national security US law because we've got a contract with a foreign corporation. It's a totally absurd idea.
Ben, would you want to add anything to this? No? Cassia?
No.
No? Okay, so it's really late. I had a great final statement to close the session, but we've run out of time. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference for those of you who are staying over tomorrow and the day after. And it's been a pleasure having you here. And I want to thank the speakers for joining us today. Ben, thank you so much for being here from the US. Cassia and Caspar flying from Poland and France.
And for more discussions on the next days.
See you around.